Well, it looks like it's official. Stephen Colbert is out of a job. The Late Show being canceled. You know, you'd think you'd get a clue when your office moves from inside the building to a trailer out back and then finally to the porta potty in the construction zone. Welcome to Grounded, the place to hear the salty truth. I'm your host, Scott Cates, coming to you live from the Northeast Georgia mountains at the tiny town of Tiger. Still hot in Tiger. I tell you, it's been an interesting year. Good grief, an interesting year altogether. Yeah, Stephen Colbert's show, The Late Show, gets canceled. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And, of course, all the conspiracy theories pop up. That's just what they do. But we'll talk about the reasons why that is. It is a shame to see The Late Show go. Introduced by David Letterman, but we'll get into that. Things change over time for sure. Thank you last week for listening to me just sort of ramble on about all the things, the music, the books, all of that. Gave me a great break from current events, of which we are going to cover today. We're going to get down to the brass tacks. So many things have happened in the last week of great importance. But boy, time is changing. It is. And it's changing in so many different ways. Let's just put time in perspective today for just a minute. Do you realize we're approaching 100 years from the Great Depression? We're coming up just a few years away from approaching 100 years from the Great Depression. So I just thought, as I'm looking at that, how do we put time in perspective, how fast it actually moves, all of it. So we are 90 years out from the start of Bing Crosby's career and the premiere of Gone with the Wind. 90 years ago. That's a long time. Seems like a long time. The premiere of Gone with the Wind, the start of Bing Crosby's career 90 years ago. How about 80 years? Go back 80 years, and it's 80 years from the initial success of Frank Sinatra and the premiere of Casablanca 80 years ago. 70 years since Elvis Presley was first introduced to America and Godzilla first appeared in movie theaters. Just 70 years. 60 years since the Beatles' invasion and the premiere of The Sound of Music. That's interesting to me, 60 years ago. And then we get down to the last 50 years. 50 years from Boston's debut album, which was just a smash, just amazing. And the premiere of Star Wars. 50 years coming up on these things. 40 years from Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. And the premiere of Back to the Future. 30 years, this shocks me actually, right here. 30 years from Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, which it's an amazing phenomenon really for its day. It's considered to be the first, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill was really considered to be the first female alternative successful album. Her being 18 years old, winning the youngest female at that time ever to have earned diamond status for the sales of her records, but it went 17 times platinum once it came out. And she became America's angry little Generation Xer, most successful popular angry little Generation Xer. And it's a great album. It sounds great. But if you listen to that album and you back up a little bit to 1988, it is real reminiscent of Edie Brickell's Shooting Rubber Bands at the Stars. And so that the hit of, like, You Learn, for instance, is almost real similar to What I Am from Edie Brickell. Anyway, so before we actually had an alternative grunge category, we had music that was out similar to that, but the first person to actually win in that category as a female, once that was opened up, was Alanis Morissette. But it's been 30 years since that album came out. That's pretty amazing. But it's also been 30 years since the premiere of James Cameron's Titanic. Recently I went back to just watch a few of these films I've gone back to actually watch. Gone with the Wind. Let me just back up a little bit, and I'll get back to the time and perspective in a minute. Gone with the Wind, really not one of my favorite films. It isn't. And I know so many people really do like it. But it wasn't one of my favorite films, very successful in its day. But now Casablanca, 80 years ago at Casablanca and Humphrey Bogart, that's a great film, little catchy one-liners, really good. What nationality are you, as they ask Rick, and he says, I'm a drunkard. I mean, these are great one-liners from Humphrey Bogart. Really good, but it's hard to believe it's been 80 years. And then The Sound of Music, 60 years ago. And I can understand why that would be successful. It's a great musical, really good. The cinematography is fantastic, because prior to this, you have a number of different companies experimenting with a number of things. We get into this sort of CinemaScope, Technicolor, full color airplane shots, and just, where the color is so vivid, and the sound is, the great care is taken in recording the sound of the soundtrack too, as well. And so it makes it it's almost like a painting, especially when you get into with The Sound of Music, the gazebo scenes, and finally the gazebo scenes where she looks at him and she realizes basically she loves him. In that moment that's taking place, there is sort of a matte finish on that cinematography that makes it a piece of art. It's really artwork. And it makes it one of the most romantic films of all time, Sound of Music, which is why it is successful. And still today, the soundtrack's still selling. As a matter of fact, they just released a 3-album set of all the outtakes and everything else that went along with that. And so interesting. So that's 60 years ago, Sound of Music, right? Star Wars. Man, Star Wars. I remember when HBO first came out and Star Wars came on and it was free to watch. I think I watched Star Wars like 100 times. Now I've gone back to, since then, to watch Star Wars, and today I'd sort of fall asleep. I just do. It's just that the storyline's just okay, because there have been so many pictures since then. It was really, really, when it first came out, just revolutionary. But since then, it's really, the theme of it all has been beat to death. And so when you go back to look at the original Star Wars, the first part of it now, it's not quite as thrilling as it was then, but you got to put into perspective the 1970s. Back to the Future. Really one of my favorite. I love it. I love the whole idea of time travel. Robert Zemeckis did a fantastic job with that film. So upon the release of that movie and it coming out, man, I went to the theaters to see it a few times. I've watched it so many times through the years. If you could go back and change time and really change life altogether, change time, who doesn't like that theme? It's a great theme, and it did really well, still does really well. I think the trilogy of Back to the Future today still sells on a regular basis. Sometimes it's funny because I'll watch in iTunes and Apple TV, basically, and see what the top 10 sellers are, and oftentimes you'll find Back to the Future back in that top 10 seller list. That's 40 years ago. And then there's James Cameron's Titanic. Now, James Cameron's Titanic, in watching this film, I thought to myself, the first time I saw it, I remember I went to the theaters to see it the first time. I left the theater with that feeling of great loss and dread. But just recently, I went back to sort of watch this film one more time. And I did this actually watching a series of Titanic films. I wanted to sort of just reference a series of Titanic films through the years. There have been so many. There was an early film based on the Titanic that was released from overseas, I think in the 30s. And then there's 1953's Titanic with Clifton Webb and Barbara Stanwyck and a very early Robert Wagner, and so when you look at that film, it's okay. But really probably the best Titanic film of all time is called A Night to Remember. It's a European film. Very good cinematography, incredible acting, wonderful, and it really keeps you glued. Then you get to James Cameron's Titanic. We sort of get the introduction of Leonardo DiCaprio for the first time in this, with Kate Winslet, starring in the lead female role, and a number of supporting actors that are in with that. And watching that film now, you see Bill Paxton, and who's in the film as well. But watching that film now, boy, that I looked at that, and the subject is really thin through the entire film. It's all about chasing a diamond necklace, basically, and the story of one passenger. It's all fiction, really. All of it is fiction. And but as you get through it, it was weird because outside of DiCaprio, it's almost like everyone sort of dialed in the acting. Kate, Winslet is just not really. I mean, there's just not really all that much to keep you really glued there. And in the days of CGI, when it was first becoming, first coming onto the scene, it's early CGI. So by the time you get to that too, I found myself actually finally going through it, just fast forwarding through scenes just to get. And by the end of it, I thought, why did I think this film was so epic? And I realized it's because of James Horner's soundtrack and Celine Dion and that song that comes to the theme of the film. It's got a great soundtrack. Sometimes great soundtracks just make a great film. Much better DiCaprio films that are out there other than Titanic, by the way. Let me say, The Aviator, fantastic film, is really good. But I'll be honest with you, Shutter Island is probably the best acting role for DiCaprio. And then there's one of my favorite movies of all time is called Inception. It's a Christopher Nolan film about being able to implant thoughts in people's dreams or whatever. It's really an amazing film, visually stunning, really good. I just wouldn't say that Titanic is DiCaprio's greatest achievement. I'm just saying in all of that. So, but anyway, that was 30 years ago, Titanic. There's my input on all that. 20 years ago, let's go back 20 years. 20 years ago, we were introduced to Kelly Clarkson and the success of American Idol. We also get Jar Jar Binks in the Star Wars reboot. Wow, that was quite the... How many times can we reboot Star Wars and beat it to death? That would be the question. But let's go back 10 years now. 10 years from now, we have Uptown Funk from Bruno Mars being the song of the year. 10 years ago, and then the success of the Avengers movie franchise in theaters 10 years ago. And that brings us basically up to today. Isn't it amazing how fast time actually does progress? And it just, in the blink of an eye, here's where you are. I look at this, I really do. And when I was going back to Alanis Morissette, one of the reasons why I put that on the list is because they just re-released 30th anniversary, a double album set, or two pieces of vinyl, actually, on 45 RPM, so not 33, so that you could get this pure quality. It sounds fantastic, limited to 4,000 copies. And when I put it down, put the needle on that to play it, it's flawless. I mean, sonically flawless. I have another version of that, which was a remastered version released about 2 or 3 years ago, that I just wanted to try out. And it's pretty good, but not like that. So on the anniversary of the release of that album, they released it, and it's not bad. But it also made me realize the angst of the Generation Xers. As I was listening through, the anger and the angst of the Generation Xers over their childhoods or whatever was what we have with Morissette. It becomes sort of the anthem at the time of, Generation Xers and, female Xers and all that. It ends up becoming that for the moment. And I realized something. Our parents, oftentimes, as Xers, our parents, we think, man, they got grumpy. We do. And it's like the generations get older, and as they get older, people just get grumpy. I don't know why. It just sort of comes across like that in some moments, but I'm thinking maybe Xers just got grumpy with finesse. I don't know. I'm just, that's kind of how that has gone. And there's your time in perspective today. Brings me to my pending pile. Why all of this? Because a lot of this was in the headlines. Actually, I saw that that The Sound of Music was in the headlines. Alanis Morissette 30 years ago was in the headlines as well. And then a few other things have been in the headlines too. But it also brought me to the point that Stephen Colbert and the Late Show, which was started by David Letterman, and it was sort of a spin-off from Johnny Carson, because Letterman was a guest host for Carson in the day. And what happens with these talk show hosts, and what we're finding today, is not the fact everybody says, well, it's all because of the Trump deal that happened with Paramount that he got canceled. He didn't get canceled for that. Ladies and gentlemen, he got canceled because they're losing $40 million a year. $40 million a year. The viewership is at an all-time low for Stephen Colbert. There's a reason. He's not funny. He's not. Even as a comedian. I remember when he first came out as a comedian, I never laughed. No, I never did. There are certain comedians that I look up and I see them, and I don't think there's much to them at all. There are great comedians that are out there. Robin Williams, fantastic. Right off the cuff, Robin Williams could take a crowd and stand in front of a crowd and ad-lib in front of a crowd and off the cuff laugh at not only himself. That's what makes a great comedian, by the way, is when a great comedian can laugh at himself and the crowd can laugh with them. It's what made Lucille Ball what she was. You want to watch a great documentary. There's one on Amazon Prime that you can get. If you've got Amazon Prime, just watch it. It's called Lucy and Desi. It's really good. And it is and there's a few documentaries that may be out there that are similar in name, but this is an actual documentary where they're using their own words. There's about 20 cassette tapes they've recorded. They've taken off of this, and they filled it in with videos. And it talks about the success of Lucille Ball and I Love Lucy and why that was so important. She was great. You could laugh at her, laugh with her, and it was good. And the good comedians can do that. They bring on, if you want to call it self-deprecating humor, and they do it so well you can laugh at them, laugh with them. It's great. And there are certain comedians I loved through the years that were great at that. Robin Williams, fantastic at what he could do. Now, at times, the material was a little over the top for me, but was good. There are other comedians I never thought were funny. Through the years as I was growing up, I thought about comedians. There were innovative comedians, guys who just did whatever, like Steve Martin. I really didn't laugh much at Steve Martin, though some of his stuff was humorous. I wouldn't say he was the greatest comedian of all time. He wasn't able to take and step up in front of a microphone and do with a crowd what other great comedians could do. When it comes to comedians and men who can step in front of a crowd and literally just captivate them, there are very few of those that have come in our lifetime. Really. Comedians have been a dime a dozen. Self-deprecating humor, Rodney Dangerfield, and no respect. Those days where he didn't have to use language, where language wasn't necessary, or stepping across the line. I remember the first comedian that was just vulgar, Andrew Dice Clay. None of that was funny. Eddie Murphy actually was funny in the beginning when the humor wasn't really, when a man doesn't have to cross the line to get into the vulgarness to make people laugh, that's amazing. Which is what made Johnny Carson so good. Why 30 years on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson could be good. Now, we're looking at The Late Show. You take a look at David Letterman, and David Letterman was a guy who could step forward and be just real cynical in a sort of a dry humor sense kind of way, and also laugh at himself. The other thing that he and Carson, neither one ever did, they never shed tears on television. Hardly ever. You never see Johnny shed tears. And you never see Letterman shed tears, except with the exception of the very last show. They never got upset at what was happening politically because everybody was even on the playing field. So they didn't, take it, they didn't take it personally. And when people did criticize them, they didn't really take that personally either. They did what they did for the sake of the humor. And that was good. And Letterman was kind of grumpy toward the end of it, and Xer's kind of like that, which is why today they can be grumpy with finesse, maybe. I don't know. But when Letterman stepped off of the basically late night, it was called Late Night with David Letterman instead of The Late Show. When he stepped off of that show was never the same. Now, Johnny Carson taking over for The Tonight Show, that was a whole different ballgame because Carson takes over And he's gone from Steve Allen. I think Steve Allen did that about 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, Steve Allen just got burnt out on doing it. And so he handed over to Jack Parr. And Jack Parr did really well, but Jack Parr was also Jack Parr was very edgy and aggressive in his humor, not in a vulgar kind of way, but he really pointed that humor. And the sarcasm was real deep in moments. And finally, at the end, when the critics came and began to attack him for his show, he took it personally, and he stepped onto the air. And after 5 years, he was completely burnt out because he lost the ability to laugh. And so they had a choice to make, really. He was either going to quit or they basically were going to cancel The Tonight Show. And they found a young man from the Midwest who already had sort of an okay show at that point, and they bring on a guy by the name of Johnny Carson, who had the ability with a look, literally just with a look. He didn't have to say anything, with the art of being able to pause in humor and wait for a minute, which is what Robin Williams had too as well. Also, Jonathan Winters had the same kind of ability to pause in a moment and allow the laughter to begin. He didn't force it. It happened naturally, and they could captivate a crowd. Because in the crowd, he could take the mirror and turn it back on them, and they could laugh at themselves as they laughed at him, and they laughed with him. That's what the beauty of a great comedian actually can do. So for 30 years, Johnny Carson steps on the air, and everybody's game. Democrat, Republican, any politician, any artist, didn't matter in all of it. And in the moment, the ability to ad-lib in the very moment. Sometimes the jokes weren't that great that he wrote. But the beauty of Carson was what he could do with an audience right in front of them in that moment, which is something Colbert could not do. He could not replicate. It's something that Jimmy Fallon at times can do. It's something that Kimmel has not been able to do. So don't be surprised if you see Kimmel on the chopping block eventually at some point. And there'll be two reasons for that. There's a reason for the loss in viewership. It's because they took politics personal. Instead of everybody being fair game, they basically took politics personal. And when they did, when Trump got elected, both end up crying, both end up talking about it's the end of humanity, all of that. And that was it. They lost viewership in that. It was Carson that warned comedians, whatever you do, don't make it personal. Don't take it personal. Everyone's game. Everyone wants to laugh. Keep the playing field even so that everyone can listen. This was a big deal. It's why this Tonight Show was so successful. And it's also why Late Night with David Letterman was so successful, because they kept the playing field even. Everything was game. Everyone could laugh. And everyone wanted to tune in. So, there you go on all of that, because the big thing, actually, big headlines right now is that. So, there's the Tonight Show, the history of all of that, and great comedians. And there's so many. This is just off the top of my head today as I'm talking about comedians today. Now, I'm getting to my pending pile. I really am right here. As I get into my pending pile, I know last week I spent a lot of time on other things. But in my pending pile today, we're going to actually start kind of with the mediocre stuff and head to the big things. The first thing that you should know that is out there right now, there's a Bluetooth flaw that exposes millions of premium headphones and speakers, by the way, to spying. And I was surprised at actually how many of these I actually had on the list. And some of these are Bose, and some of these are Sony. And I realized Marshall, the Marshall Bluetooth speakers that were out there, I actually have two of those. It was interesting in getting into this article to find out and discover that not only can your phone calls be listened to, but while these items are plugged in, you can be listened to all the time. Not only that, but while you're attached to Bluetooth, they can be getting into your phone, watching every click that you make, all of this. And I know today we look at this and all of this has been, oh my goodness, conspiracy theory, but now it's a reality. The list is fairly short at this point because they don't quite know the extent of how many of these headphones have been messed with. But there's a possibility that if you're listening to Bluetooth headphones, somebody's listening. And we've already known that. Everyone's listening in. The algorithm is going 9,000 miles an hour trying to get your attention off of whatever it is to buy whatever they want or to turn your whole life into the direction that they want to turn it to. That's a bottom line in all of it. Now, they're working on patch fixes, but in this article that I read, some of these aren't coming quickly. No, because they don't want to give up the power oftentimes. That's why they're not coming quickly. So I guess I'm telling you today, if you are music buffs and you're listening on great high-end headphones or, headphones right now, make sure that you update your software so they can plug in the patch. Also, the other thing, major Microsoft hacking has been taking place over the last couple of weeks too as well. They're trying to get it scrambled to get. As of today, there was not a patch for that either, as hacking and spying is going on. And I know some of you are like, well, this is always going on. It is. And I know we think it doesn't affect you, and it doesn't until the day it does. So there you go. As I continue to move back in my articles of importance here. Let me go to Trump's approval rating. Trump's approval rating right now. This is really interesting as I looked at this. As far as approval rating among Republicans for his programs that he has placed into place, for his immigration, for the tax bill, for all of it. Currently, right now, he sits with Republicans anywhere from 90 to 95%, depending on the program. It's true. The national approval rating sits at an average amongst all of the polls at an average of 52%, which is pretty high. He keeps edging up more and more and more. This would be the reason why the viewers are going down for certain television shows. I'm telling you, they're tired of hearing it. And then finally, the bombshell article that has come up. There is a bombshell article today. And there are the details behind the conspiracy against Trump. If you look into this and what Tulsi Gabbard is actually getting into here, releasing 100 pages. Now, there are a lot of things that have happened over the last 2 or 3 months. And it's funny because what happens is you have people that look up and they say, that's conspiracy theory. And everything from the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, had connections to the CIA, all that was conspiracy theory. Then we find out it actually wasn't. Really, over the last 45 days, you discover it. No, actually, he had actually greater ties than they thought with the CIA. What does all that mean? I'll explain it to you in a minute. And now, all of a sudden, here comes Tulsi Gabbard, and she tells you about an Obama-era conspiracy. Now, what's so sad about this? There's 100 documents that they released last Friday. What's so sad about this, and the nuts and bolts of it basically at the bottom, mean this. After Trump got elected, upon that, Obama really begins with the Department of Justice a move to undermine the presidency of Donald Trump. Now, so the issue here, and by the way, this is a normal thing. I did a podcast a while back and talking about how for the last number of years or so, when Democrats leave office, they sabotage everything to try to wreck the success of the next person that's coming in. Now, let me explain why this is. You need to understand, this is a play off the Democrat playbook. And it gets more intense as the years go by. And a part of that is because of really starting about the Johnson era or so. Really, if you really go back to FDR for a minute, which the nation becomes sort of successful. War helps out with that during FDR. But all the programs are really an extreme government overreach is what it really is in order to sort of feed into the economy to make it successful. And FDR is the king of that. Big programs, big government, large government, and it reduces the freedom of the people. The conservative comes back in, like Eisenhower, and says, okay, we want to do some infrastructure. After Truman, Eisenhower comes in, builds the interstate highway system, does all of that, but also begins to release, basically back, let go of all the government overregulation. And the conservatives, quote unquote, the conservative actually cuts back all of the government overreach into people's everyday and the states' lives, basically. And they pull it all apart. And they hand the power back to the people. That's what they've done for quite some time. Well, then you end up with Kennedy in 1960. Now, Kennedy, considering to be on so many different scales, you see, people look at him as a great president in history, but the reality is November 22nd, 1963, he's elected in 1960 for the election, so he doesn't have very long to actually lead. Folks, this is important because really there are not a lot of programs. He's written quite a few books, and Kennedy, really, if you get down to it, when does he have the time? He's hanging out in Las Vegas, he bungles the Bay of Pigs crisis in all of that. He does all of this, really. And then at the same time, he's got this affair and that affair and this affair going on outside. I mean, good grief. But he's looked at and people say, oh, he's a great president. They think that because he was assassinated. And let me just call the truth what it is. It is. And so, to be honest with you, he had an idea of, in this idea of actually of civil rights. I get all of that. He's moving forward with all of that. But the truth is, the person who actually puts all of this into practice ends up being Johnson. Lyndon Johnson ends up putting those laws basically into practice and carrying on this initiative. Now, being from Texas, that's a real shock in some ways. But then Lyndon Johnson picks up where FDR left off, ends up moving forward in this whole great society, pushing forward an enormous amount, huge government expansion once again. And then when he leaves office, he's not going to run for office another term. So he leaves office, Nixon goes into office. And during that time, we've got to do something because the economy is already starting at a shambles because of the overreach of programs. Nixon goes into office, and taking you back through history, give me just a minute. Nixon goes through office, and then Carter gets elected. And my goodness, does Carter just put in this program, Department of Education, all these different programs that end up costing the American taxpayer more money in the process. He leaves office in 1980. He's elected out. Ronald Reagan comes back into office and decides to put into effect what we know as Reaganomics. He hires great economists. He ends up signing, literally at his ranch, Reaganomics into law. And within about 18 months, we see some success in the nation. And it begins to thrive. And it thrives. And we go through that thriving because George Bush Sr. goes into office. He signs Reaganomics into law, and we're successful. Then we get to Clinton, and this is where things begin to change. Bill Clinton becomes the president of the United States, and for 7 years, he just does nothing but sign Reaganomics back into law. But knowing that Reaganomics is working well and we're successful as a nation and all of that seems to be working well, in the 8th year, his final year, at the 7-year mark, he authors his own idea of an economic plan, which is a disaster. And it's almost like sabotage that you begin to crumble the American economy because of who's coming back into office. And the reason to do this, and the reason why the Democrats actually do this, is to try to destroy the legacy of success that conservatives have actually had. And this is not a conspiracy theory, it's a reality. So what we see for the first time is Clinton's aides, everybody leaves office, and in comes George W. Bush's crowd. And when they come in the door, they come to computers that have been locked down, frozen up on porn screens, every one of them, as they come in to try to sabotage and prevent any success from happening at this point. We have Clinton, who's laid down just a bomb of a economic plan that there is no way, because it takes the new president coming in a year to two to overcome the last president's economic plan. And by the end of about the second year in office, we end up in a recession. We do. It's really bad by the time we get there. And we start this downhill shift of which George W. Bush tries to overcome in the process by signing back over Reaganomics, back over Alan Greenspan coming back into the picture, really trying to get a recovery on an economy that's in basic free fall. And we have to recover from a recession. Then we get into Barack Obama. Barack Obama is basically, good grief, Obamacare, which is really the Great Society and, the whole FDR New Deal, all of this stuff, the greatest overreach in history. You don't have health care, we're going to charge you $1,200. We're going to fine you $1,200. You're forced to buy health care. Good grief, what a mess. Oh, a train wreck. And it essentially is the overtaking. We see the two things that actually happen during these eras, basically. During the Clinton era, we see the overthrowing of the banking industry, and we see during the Obama era, the overthrowing of the insurance industry. And banking and insurance, by the way, economically, were the two largest industries in America that are now overthrown by the government. It's true. That's really what happens here. And so why we see we're in the situation that we're in now. So the sabotage that takes place creates a mess and tries to create the same idea of the blame of what happened during the Great Depression, supposedly all Herbert Hoover's fault, but it really isn't Hoover's fault. It's the programs that came before and the horrible presidents we had before Hoover ever came into office, and the recovery was so, we didn't have the technology of today. So we end up in this Great Depression, which is blamed on whoever's in office at the time. But it all has to do with the sabotage of who's coming to destroy the legacy of that party so that the new party coming in can reign for however long. By the way, let me say this. It doesn't happen from the other side. Conservatives don't do this. They leave office and you don't see porn on the computers and all this sabotage taking place. They leave office, and they leave office with things pretty good in hand until the liberal comes and decides to remove all the rules and go for the government overreach again. Just the bottom line and the way that it is. So as we get into all of this, by the time we get to here now, at what extreme will we go for a president who's leaving office to destroy the legacy of one who's coming in that he knows is going to do well? Because now you got to cover up from the fact that you jet set and went to Broadway tonight. Now you're in San Francisco another night. You're in Los Angeles another. Just flying all over the world, having a great time, which is what Barack Obama basically did. Name me another piece of legislation that this guy actually did that benefited anything. Really, there's not any. And he knows that Trump is going to come into office, and he already has an idea, and he's looking at Trump's plan going, oh my gosh, because he knows right off the bat when we instill these things, boom, 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 America's going to be made great. So we got to figure out a way to tear this down. So the last few months in office, after the November election, there's a plan that begins. And this is what we're seeing here out of these 100 documents. That plan that begins is the intention to overthrow the election by undermining Donald Trump. Now, you only got a couple of months before Trump takes office. The problem with this is that after Obama leaves office, they keep it going on. And how much of this discussion that's happening behind the lines and is covered up while it's going on, and the men that are involved here, including a guy who's now no longer the president of the United States, but an average citizen now who is trying to do what they're doing to undermine not only the government, but the man who's in office, to mess with his legacy so that it doesn't look like he did nothing for 8 years. That's basically what this actually comes down to. And Tulsi Gabbard has stepped up and said, we're going to release these 100 pages. Now, why didn't he do this the first time? This is the question people ask. Why did Trump not do this the first time that he was in office? Because the first time there were people that were there saying, wait a minute, the American public can't handle this. Listen to him, the American public can't handle it. Because he promised then to release the Kennedy files and do all the American public can't handle it. American public can't. And for the sake of the American public, and basically, I guess he was saying at the time, civil unrest. And he bought into all of that. And then by the end, listening to all of these advisors, he gets swept into the COVID-19 campaign, which ends up being the biggest joke of all time by the time it gets over, really, on all of it. And that being the case, and we see Rogan this past week actually interviewing Newsom saying, wait a minute, what about the fact that you're forcing these children to take this vaccine? And now in your state, the record number of myocarditis and cancer has risen in your children. And so we see all of that basically taking place there. Trump, ends up listening to advisor. Not this time. This time, you'll get 4 years in office, and he says, I don't care. Here's the deal. And there's a reason. One thing changed while he stood on a stage when the bullet pierced the ear. That's what changed. When he got into office, he said, that's it. No more government cover-ups. It's time that the American people understood the truth, and it's time we got down to fixing the issues, and that's exactly what he's done, which is why he's wildly popular. 90 to 95% approval rating on his programs, and why 52% of Americans today, no matter what the party, agree with what he is doing. And part of the issue is the uncovering and the unmasking of what happened in the government, and part of the decline in all of the listening and the viewership and all of that that's going on, because not only that, podcasts have decreased in their listening of liberal podcast. All of this that's been taking place has happened because America is sick and tired of being snowed, period. Getting down to the brass tacks of it, there it is. And we see the Trump administration literally getting down to the brass tacks saying some things need to be fixed here. Now, the issue is going to be, can we get past executive orders after it's all over so that this can actually go on long distance? Because the next thing that will probably happen is they'll try to elect someone to go into office to unravel all of this that really is successful. There you go. What's all this mean? What does all this mean? Well, the American people throughout the years have always been snowed in one way or another. And it's either been the media that's been doing the snowing or the focus on propaganda, if you want to call it that, because it is. The media has been used for that. It was used during World War II for that. It's what brought about the metal drives and the wood drives. They didn't really realize how serious or what we actually took when we went to war. We went on these metal drives to melt down metal. During that time, it was interesting because I have a stand-up bass that was made pre-war, and the tuners on it are pre-war tuners, because after that, for a couple of years, they couldn't make the tuners for instruments because the metal was all being used for the war effort. I work on antique automated musical things like music boxes and crank record players and all that. All that stuff was being handed over, melted down, torn apart. The wood was being reused. The metal was for the war effort. And the media was pushing the war effort. Don't get me wrong. It was needed, I guess, in the day, and it made America successful. But America has always sort of followed along with whatever the narrative was until now. Because once we learned that Americans would follow along with the narrative, it just kept on pressing that narrative. And whoever was in power and the most powerful pressed that narrative then. Now the whole idea is to expose and be transparent and see exactly how far we would go to push that narrative. Anyway, it's not new. It was happening. Matter of fact, a year after the American Revolution, and it's taking place basically, a year after the Declaration of Independence, Americans are tired. They're weary of war. They're weary of the calamity of war. And they're weary, and the press is focusing on the calamity of war. You have actually sympathizers for the British during that time that are pressing that. And so it's not new. You've got men who are going against, honestly, the British and writing for the sake of freedom. One of the most famous that we actually have is Benjamin Franklin. And it's interesting for Benjamin Franklin because he not only writes on his own terms at times, but he also writes in the voice of Silas Dogood, who's supposed to be like a housewife, basically, and writes against the atrocities that are going on and the need for freedom. And he does a very successful job at doing that. But as the nation is formed, It's interesting. We have a man who comes onto the scene at 55 years old, September 30th, 1777, and he gives a speech. And that speech is unlike any other. And we'll get into that in a minute. So, with all of this, brings me to Proverbs 18 for just a minute. Because the idea of this is to sort of isolate you away and to keep things, from you. I look at Proverbs 18. There are a few verses that I see here that are coming true today and that are a reality today and are being realized out of Proverbs 18 right now in history. And here's what they are. Number one, a man who isolates himself, Proverbs 18:1, seeks his own desire, and he rages against all wise judgment. Folks, let me say this. Over the last few years, the isolation, honestly, that social networking, all of that has brought, the bottom line is it's been very difficult for people to make wise judgment because of the fact they've become isolated and end up being just pummeled by things that are distracting them on so many different levels. Just a reality. And we see that this proverb ends up becoming true. Some of the dumbest decisions ever made in our lifetimes have been made in times of crisis by knee-jerk reaction, and the fact that if we can isolate the people, if you can isolate the people and feed them the narrative, they'll just reject anything that might be wise judgment. Another verse out of Proverbs 18 that we're actually seeing come true now. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, but before honor is humility. Now, we do see pride step up, and a lot of people who are very prideful and step up. And when they do, we're going to see some of these that are very prideful that have stepped up. We see some of these like James Comey that are really going through some, who were very prideful stepping up in their position. We may see Barack Obama who stepped up very prideful in his position. And I realized that now for Donald Trump, what's amazing about Donald Trump is he stepped into office. But he stepped into office, and you look at him and you say, well, he's a prideful guy. He's a haughty guy. But there really is a humility side to him. And I know some of you are going to be like, but there really is. He stepped up, and he has sort of this persona that's there. He has not changed. He's not changed. And the principal idea of all of this is to let the American people basically know what's going on, first of all. Second of all, to make it a better, really improve, fix the issues that are going on. And those who sat in their pride thinking that they're untouchable now have become suddenly touchable, and that pride is coming. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and we see this. That's coming true as we see it now. But there's one verse that's sandwiched in between these. It's a very powerful verse. It changed the tide when America really, by 1777, wanted to give up. And really, there was a state in time by the end of the Biden era that lots of people just wanted to just forget it, give up. I mean, good grief. How are we going to combat this? How can we combat the things that are this legislation of immorality and all of these things that were coming down the pike, that were creating this great depressive spirit within the nation? And then coming out of that, just a few months now, we are in July, literally 6 months into a new presidency that literally has stepped up and said, set your sights on the things that are right and set your sights on God. One of the things I would be dead today if it were not for God who helped me and put me into place. These are the thing. But the pointing of the direction is this. He just had a huge meeting with faith-based leaders saying, how can we infuse this and include this? This is what makes America great. Because 18:10 is an important verse. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous run to it, and they are safe. Listen to me when I say this to you. There are a lot of people that step beyond Scripture and think it's not going to affect them. One thing I can tell you today is that God's word is truth. And the things that are written there, no matter what culture tries to dictate or other people try to tell you, or whatever some narrative is, the things of this book really do come around and end up truth. That's why it's been still, even today, a bestseller. About 10 years ago, it became a bestseller again in a country that had completely abandoned all of it, which was Norway. Norway turns its nation around, heading back to the scriptures. And we're seeing some of the same things today. Samuel Adams stepped up. September 30th of 1777. And in a nutshell, he basically says, this is kind of a paraphrase out of this speech, a few lines, but let me just take it to you here. Adams is actually referred to as the patriarch of liberty. He was an unmoving man. He was a man of God that was unmoving. And at 55 years old on this particular day, he steps up in front of his peers and in front of a large crowd who's ready to give up in the moment, and he gives them this speech. And here's what he says. Remove your eyes. Remove your eyes from the oppression of the weight of the public calamities that you see. Do not let the feelings of others regulate yours. Take your eyes off the press and all that destroys public confidence, because we are not driven by such narrow straits. We are the ones that appeal to heaven. It's in heaven that we've placed our trust. Numerous have been the manifestations of God's providence to us, so do not let the gloominess of others remove the remembrance of the providence of God. We must rely in humble confidence on Him who is mighty to save. Remember, heaven will never abandon us. We must always remember that the name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous run to it, and they are safe. And at those words, it really changed the tide. It shifted the tide of this nation, and they stuck to the pursuance of freedom as the patriarch of American liberty stepped up and reminded us that our safe harbor and our foundation was never found in our might, that our safe harbor and our foundation was never found in our policies, that our safe harbor and our foundation is always found in the Lord. The name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous run to it, and they are safe. You've been listening to Grounded, the place to hear the salty truth. What does all this mean? Oh, there's calamity everywhere. It is. It's all over the place. And so the focus on that calamity, and if the press can take that focus and focus you on that calamity and the things that are going on and pull your focus off of that strong tower, they'll do it. Anything to keep your sights off of heaven. Honestly, of the fact that we're beyond, especially if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, that you're first and foremost a citizen of heaven. Your citizenship has been changed. Secondly, you're a citizen of your country that you reside in currently. But never forget that your freedom is found and always kept in the one who is a strong tower. And He is our safety. First of all, if you do not know Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, you are missing so much in your life. It's true. The one who created you, the one who established this nation, the one who really is the original, is the author of absolute truth in all of it. The one who knows you better than you know yourself. If you don't know Jesus Christ as Savior, that begins a relationship with God that's amazing. It begins a relationship with God that would start you in the walking of absolute truth, which is amazing when that begins, but a life that is abundant and a peace that surpasses all understanding. I'm not trying to sell you something today. I'm trying to tell you the reality of it all. Does that mean it's going to be free from hardship? No. But it does mean that during that hardship, you'll understand and realize, and that your faith gets stronger even in those things. That there's a peace that you can't even describe that happens when these things are happening. While the whole world is crumbling, there's a peace that you have because your faith and your trust is in God. and it establishes that, and the strength comes to your life, and a trust for your future, and a trust for your days ahead. Each step that you walk comes into your life because you trust the one who leads and guides you every day if you belong to Jesus. How does that happen? How do you walk with God? Well, you stop at some point and you realize and you recognize that there's something in the way between you and God, and that one thing is your sin, everything you've ever done wrong. The greatest description comes from a third grade boy over the last few weeks, really. Actually, and not only that, but a couple of years ago, a girl who was in the fourth grade who said to me, I said, "What are you being saved from?" She said, "I'm being saved from my sins." Because so many people say you're being saved from hell. No, it's your sins that get you placed there. You're being saved from your sins. They're ultimately yours. They're in the way of the relationship between you and God. It's an offense to God that's in the way of the relationship. And it needs to be forgiven by God so that that relationship can come to life and be greater than it ever has been. So the offense of your sin needs to be forgiven in order for you to walk with God. And my little third grade boy explained it like this: my sins are everything I did wrong yesterday, and they're everything I will do wrong even tomorrow. Yes. And he said, I need to be forgiven of those, all of them. Faith like a child still applies no matter your age. So the question today is, would you drop the haughty heart? Because often people say, what do I need this for? People say that. Just drop the haughty heart and come before God and say, here I am. I do want to start and begin a relationship. And the scripture's real clear. In Philippians, it says, he that begins a good work in you will see it through to fruition. That's important. Let God begin this great work of a great walk with him today. And you do that by simply stepping before him and saying, Lord, I know that my sins are in the way of a walk between me and you. Please forgive me of those, all of them, so I can begin a walk and begin a life in which you lead me and you guide me, and that it can be abundant and great for the days that are ahead. Also, at the same time, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ today, keep your sights set on that strong tower. Like Samuel Adams said, look above. Absolutely look above the calamity of this day. Look beyond all of the things that are being thrown at you from the news and the algorithms and all that. Keep your sights set on that strong tower, and you're set and focused on that strong tower, and run to that tower, because that is where we will always be safe. I thank you for listening to Grounded today. It's good to get down to the brass tacks sometimes. Hopefully you got a lot out of the podcast today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for listening.